The next step in our journey of reading the text is to think through what was being emphasized. And again, according to genre, we're going to be able to observe different types of things. And so in this video, I want to think about narratives and gospels because they're closely related, because within the gospels there's certain stories, of course. And so when we think about a narrative, narratives are primarily structured around setting, characters, and plot. And so when we think about setting, we want to think about what's going on in terms of time. What was the time? It could be as specific of as it was night, or it could be as broad as in the days of the judges, you know. And so, but there's also, we want to consider the place. So oftentimes, we may be fairly unfamiliar with the geography in which the stories in the Bible took place, but that's where a good Bible dictionary or study Bible can help us out, though, as well as to what's going on in terms of place. And when we think even of that story of Luke 7, he was in Galilee. He was in the northern area of Israel. Jesus was away from kind of the central hub of all the major religious activity, which is down in Jerusalem. And so here he is kind of on the outskirts and reaching those who were on the outside as well. And so place helps us to see that again, to be able to locate where place is can be helpful to be able to establish the setting of where we are and what's going on. The environment as well, we want to take in consideration as we think about the setting of both the physical and the social. So I think of, again, Mark 4, where Jesus was at night told the disciples to go to the other side on the lake. And so again, in terms of place and in terms of night, in terms of time being at night, the environment could be one where it could have been tense. There's storms that rise up out of nowhere on the Sea of Galilee, and the disciples could have had a legitimate amount of fear even going into that journey across to the other side. And so our environment kind of helps set the stage for being able to see kind of what the setting is and what's going on in the story. Here's a couple more examples. In 2 Samuel 11:1, it says this: "In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem." And we know this is the setup to the David and Bathsheba story. Okay, so this is the famous setting. You know, David should have been going out to battle, and he remained, though, at home in Jerusalem. We don't know exactly why, but this is all the narrator gives us, and it gives us a little bit of insight as to what was then maybe leading to David's downfall. Another famous setting is in Ruth 1:1. In the days, I mentioned earlier, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons. And so the days of the judges, when the judges ruled, should give us some context that this was a predominantly dreadful, wicked time. Regularly, the nation was spiraling downward. And this famine was probably there to even get the attention of the Israelites, as God would do certain things to get their attention so that they could turn back to him. And so, but what the contrast then is in the book of Ruth is that you have this story of this non-Israelite named Ruth, and she becomes the heroine of the story. She's the one that's the godly one, and the one that also then she meets, named Boaz, who is an Israelite. And so that's Ruth 1:1. And then I mentioned earlier about Mark 4:35. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, let's go across to the other side. Again, that night and the storms that come up at night on the Sea of Galilee. And then there's this one in Luke that, again, where we've already been looking at a little bit, is when the Pharisees asked him to eat with him. He went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Behold, a woman of the city came. She knew that he was reclining at the table at the Pharisee's house and brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And so here you have this setting where it's at a Pharisee's house. And again, we've done our historic cultural context to know a little bit more about Pharisees and the potential of this Pharisee not necessarily being a seeker of Jesus, but a skeptic of Jesus and seeking to put him to the test. But then this woman, also as part of the setting, comes into this scene and disrupts the party in a Pharisee's house, somewhere where she would have never stepped foot in otherwise. And so those are some settings that help us to be able to get a little bit of an idea of what may be going on in the story. The next thing are characters. And again, as we think about these examples, when we think of the 2 Samuel 11:1, the character being David. But the other character that has not yet been introduced is, as we know, Bathsheba. And so this story obviously revolves, around these two characters. Again, Ruth, you have these other people mentioned that in the days of the judges ruled, there was a famine land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah. He dies within like the first 3 verses, and we never hear of him again, really. And his wife, she becomes prominent in the book, and the rest of the book, Naomi. And then their two sons die again, also within the first 3 verses. And so they don't prove to be prominent either in the story, but they're setting it up. And who becomes prominent then is Ruth, as she's then introduced, and then Naomi, and then Boaz. And so, again, we want to look at the characters and how the author and the narrator is using these characters to move the story along. And then again in Mark 4:35, on that day when evening had come, he said to them, who's them? Well, it's the disciples, and let us go across the other side. Well, what's interesting about the disciples is that prior to this kind of story in Mark 4:35 are all these parables, these 4 parables where Jesus, it says, and he said to them, and then he said to them, and then he said to them, and then he said to them, and now here is another he said to them. And it's almost as if Jesus now, to his disciples, as part of as the characters, is moving from the classroom to the lab, and he's taking them out, and he's going to teach them differently now. But again, it's this story centered around these disciples, that these disciples needed to learn something. And obviously the other main character of the story is Christ himself. And then this last story is, again, the Pharisee is prominent in the story and set up as a contrast to the woman. What's interesting about the woman in this story is we never even know her name. We just know her identity as a sinner. And what's, again, interesting is how the narrator, as Luke is just drawing us into the story, is that we know Simon the Pharisee, but we hardly know this woman, as she is set up in contrast to Simon the Pharisee as one who's then honored in the story. But there's other characters in the story as well. It says at the very end that the crowd that was there questioned and said, who is this who even forgives sins? And so there's a sense of that there are these onlookers. And I think what Luke is doing in the story is even allowing us or kind of putting us into the scene as an onlooker to ask that very question. Who is this? Who is this one who forgives sins? And so characters now then prove prominent in these stories to help move the story along